much for listening to this presentation here at the 7th AIEE Energy Symposium on Energy Security. My name is Marc Gronwald. I am with Xianjiang Liverpool University, that is in Suzhou in China. I will now start sharing my screen so that you can follow my presentation. I hope you can see that well. So the title of the paper I am presenting today is called Measuring Multi-Scale Connectedness Between Green Bond and Green Equity Using a Thick Pen Method. So this is a joint project with Sanya, who is currently at the University of Essex in the UK. Maybe I can mention briefly that she is looking for a job. So if someone is looking for a very talented empirical energy economist, please let me know, and then I can pass the contact details on. But now moving back to the presentation. So ultimately, this paper is about green bonds and green equity, but it is also promoting, let's say, promoting an innovative methodological approach, the thick pen method. So this means in this presentation, I will talk about, well, obviously about both. So I will emphasize the method, but I will also talk about, well, the results and the markets we are looking at and so on. So to give you a short summary, of course, well, we are all aware of the terms climate finance and environmentally conscious investment and so on. So I don't think I have to say much about this. So we see of this. And of course, we also know that there is already an academic literature emerging, which is looking at how these, say, investment opportunities are changing overall the way investors are acting in financial markets. Here on this paper, I'm just mentioning, here on the slide, I'm just mentioning one paper, which is looking at diversification opportunities because of that emerge because of green bond and green equity markets. So there's, of course, there are a lot more other papers out there I simply cannot include into this short presentation. Okay, we are looking in this paper into the co-movement between green bonds and green equity. And we use this novel non-parametric approach, which is called thick pen transform. So I will explain the method a little bit later, but the key focus or the key advantage of this method is that we can look at co-movement across different investment horizons or different timescales. And of course, what we are finding is relevant, well, not only for an academic audience, but also to investors and to policymakers. So I will just try to summarize the data. So this paper is really rich in terms of data. So we are using green bond indices. We're using green equity indices. So a number of different ones: green buildings, water, transportation, clean energy focused, and so on. We are using broad stock market indices: MSCI World Index, MSCI World Energy Index, and MSCI Global Environment. And then we are also using a global bond index. On top of this, we are also trying to include US economic policy uncertainty index, and then also Dow Jones Sustainability World Composite Index. So of course, in this presentation, I can only really give you a short idea of the results we are actually getting. But I just want to highlight in the paper, which we will be hopefully circulating soon, there is a lot of interesting data as well. So here, just one quick overview. So we're using these daily log returns of these markets. Well, and of course, well, as you can see, so there are the typical features you would expect in financial market data. Of course, there is some sort of so there is volatility clustering, and obviously at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, we see these extreme fluctuations in many of the series. But then interestingly, in some series, this remains high, the volatility, whereas in other series, it goes back to where it was before the pandemic. So that's maybe one short way to summarize this. So again, more details of the data would be in the paper. Okay, so the method we are using. So this goes back to two papers. One is two methods. One is called thick-pen measure of association, and that has been pioneered by Frülewitsch and O in 2011. So that's published in a non-economic journal or non-finance journal. So essentially, we are also importing this method into the energy economic and energy finance literature. And building on this method by Frülewitsch and O from 2011, there's also a more general version, which is called multi-thickness thick-pen measure of association. And that's by Jach from 2021. Okay, the following bullet points describe the method. It's a non-parametric method, and it can be used for stationary and non-stationary time series. It can be 2 series we are analyzing, or it can be a multivariate setting, so more than 2. We can capture time varying results, and we can also look at different time scales. And it's a purely visually interpretable method. So we can produce a lot of really beautiful graphs using this. Okay, I do have 2 slides with some mathematical details here, but I think in this short presentation, I would like to just briefly show those. Maybe I want to highlight that the key difference between the first method I mentioned and the second one is that the first one is able to quantify co-movement between 2 or more time series for a given time scale, whereas this more general version can also quantify the co-movement at multi-time scales. So I will explain in a moment when I talk about some of the results we have, what exactly that means. But I want to spend maybe a few moments on an intuitive illustration of what the method actually does. So imagine that you are plotting a time series of observations by hand on a piece of paper. So imagine you're doing this. How do you do this? Well, you create a scatter plot of the points over time of your observations. And then obviously you use a pen and you connect these points over time. And then you have a time series plot. That's clear, isn't it? So the thick pen measure of association is essentially redoing this exercise using pens of different thickness. So say you use a very fine pencil to connect your points. So that would be one way to do this. Yeah, so it goes up and down. Or you use something like a marker. So one of these you write on the whiteboard. Huh? So you basically use this thicker pen, and then of course you would be connecting those points you're creating in a very different way. And what this then yields is that that these different thicknesses of the pen capture different features of the data. So this smaller thickness pen, so your fine pencil, is able to capture high frequency movements, so very refined. Whereas this thicker pen, so your board marker, yeah, you go over the data once, and this then ultimately captures all your points in a slightly rougher way, which then can be interpreted as a measure or a means to capture low frequency movements. And to briefly try to compare what this method can do with more established methods is the following. Of course, we are all familiar with what correlation can do. Of course, correlation gives you one number. It is a time domain measure, but it's not varying over time. Yeah. So for a given sample, you get a correlation coefficient, one number, and that's it. And of course, this tells you something about the co-movement of 2 time series, but not everything. So when you move from correlation to measures such as coherency, yeah, so that is correlation in the frequency domain. So this means you can make statements about correlation of long-term components and correlation of short-term components of the data. But it's still a time invariant measure. And if we then move on to the thick pen measure of association, what we are using here, it is a time varying measure. So this means the co-movement might get stronger or weaker over time. And then also we can look at different time scales. And these time scales are in some way similar to these cycles in a frequency domain analysis. So we can also make statements about long-term components of data and short-term components of data and the relationship of those. And then finally moving on to the MTTPMA method. So in this method, this method can do everything what I said before, but here we can also look at the relationship of, say, the short-term component of one time series and the long-term component of another time series. So that's what I mean by cross-scale or cross-frequency relationships. So that's what the method can do. Okay, now so as I said, we can, it's a visually interpretable method. So it's non-parametric, so there are no estimates, and there are no confidence intervals, and there's no inference. I can just show you these graphs, but of course these graphs, they can tell you a lot. So, and here in this short presentation, I only have one of several graphs we would have in the paper. So here we are looking at the relationship between green bond and green equity. And in this particular case, it's clean energy. So we use different thickness parameters, 22, 126, 252, and 504. And because we have daily data, this represents 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, and 2-year components of the data. And if we look into these plots here, if we move along the main diagonal, we are essentially moving from the thickness parameters from 22 up to 504. So we are essentially measuring the co-movement of the components of the same type. So this means here would be the co-movement of the short-term components, and then at the bottom right down here would be the co-movement of the 2 long-term components of the series. And what we can see is that, well, so this measure is fluctuating between 0.5 and 1 most of the time, but we can see that these short-term components, the co-movement is fluctuating much more than the co-movement of the long-term components. And I think this general finding is, I think that's in principle what you would expect, huh? Because ultimately, if we are looking at the long-term components of the data, we are essentially filtering out short-term fluctuations. And then given that these the variables, so the time series we are using here, so green bonds and green equities, of course, ultimately they are driven by a similar set of fundamentals. In principle, so this is why the long-term co-movement would be higher than the short-term co-movement. Okay, so that's one important finding, and also important to illustrate how to interpret these graphs. And if we move from the main diagonal to the off diagonal, so then we are looking at the relationship between, say, the long-term, the short-term component of one series and the long-term component of another series. And I think that's a very interesting feature of this method we're using, because most of the existing co-movement measures, and I think recently a number of interesting ones have been proposed, they cannot really capture this. And I think so here we actually can show that there are also differences over time. So the long, so for instance here in this graph here, I hope you can see my little cursor here. So there's this strong decline here that's in 2019 2020 between these 2 series. So here we can clearly see that in principle the co-movement between these components is relatively high, so similar to the other components, but then there's a very strong drop here, and then it drops to almost 0. And this period gets even longer when we use the even longer components. Okay, anyway, I think, as I said, it's a short presentation only, so I don't have time to discuss all this in detail. Here we try to summarize all these results in one table. Again, I don't have time to go through all of them, so you would find a detailed discussion of this in the paper. So this means after having discussed and having highlighted what the method is able to do, I'm already on the last slide, and I would like to summarize the key findings of the paper. So we do find that the co-movement is is higher among the long-term components compared to the short-term components. And then we also find that the overlaps between the green bond index and the green transportation index is high in the long run. Okay, so that's a specific finding I couldn't really highlight in detail earlier. But then we also find that the overlaps between the green bond index and green building and solar index is lower in the long run. And we find evidence of asymmetric effects in the cross co-movement. So what do I mean by this? So an asymmetric finding would mean that, for instance here, this figure, so this subplot here looks different than the subplot here. So this means the 1 year component of one series and the two year component of the other, and then the other way around. And the co-movement between those is not the same. So this means there's some sort of an asymmetric effect. Okay, and then finally we can also find that there's a degree of co-movement between the green bonds and the policy uncertainty, and also between co-movement of the green bonds and the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And in principle, I think these results make a useful contribution to the literature, but then they're also similar to a recent paper by Ciaziano et al. From 2021, who find that the short-term and long-term co-movement, they do not co-movement synchronously, rather it varies depending on financial and economic events. So that's what this paper is doing. I think we like the method which we would like to promote. That's of course one objective of the paper, but then also, as I said before, the findings we get, they are also interesting from a financial market, from a trading, or from a practical perspective, and also from a policy perspective. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I will now stop sharing my screen, and then if there are any questions, or if you would like to get a copy of the paper, please send me an email. You can find my email address here on the bottom of the slide. Thank you very much.